It does 14-bit RAW at 11 frames per second, which exactly matches the Sony a6400 and is 1 frame better than the Canon M50. So in that department, this camera totally holds up. Now, most people buying this camera are most likely going to shoot JPEGs, and I have to say the JPEGs in this camera are fantastic. I got great colors and even got a little bit of flexibility for colors. When it comes to photos, there's really nothing in this camera that's going to hold you back. But video is where you really start to see the difference. This camera does 4K up to 30 frames per second without a crop. And in full HD is where this camera really shines. It does up to 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion and a separate 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion. If you're like me and you love slow motion, this camera is a must. So what exactly makes this camera so special? One of those things is the low light features with that 20 megapixel sensor. So let's get nerdy and talk about the low light in this camera. If you have 20 megapixels versus 26 or 32 megapixels on the same size sensor, naturally you have bigger megapixels. By having bigger megapixels, there's less light that's falling between the megapixels, and by having bigger megapixels, it can simply capture more light. And because there's fewer megapixels, the noise on this camera is also not as pronounced. This camera has much better low light compared to an M50 or most of the other camera manufacturers out there. Most cameras top out at about 3200 ISO. This camera easily stays clean up to 5000, 6400 ISO. In video mode, this camera still looks really good in low light. So when it comes to autofocus in this camera, for photos, it is really good. I'm actually kind of shocked by how much of an improvement this is over the Nikon DSLRs that I've used, like the D3500 and the D5600. This camera is absolutely going to deliver for you. You're never really going to have a problem with autofocus. This camera is extremely user-friendly and easy to use. Now, this camera is really aimed at hobbyists, people that are just casual shooters that just want to take personal photos and videos. Let's talk about design. When it comes to the physical design, this camera is a pleasure to hold. This grip is so nice and deep, and this camera is made for vlogging, and I think this camera delivers an excellent vlogging experience. The physical ergonomics on this camera are fantastic. The buttons are exactly where they need to be. They're actually really clicky, and the buttons actually feel nicer to touch than both the Sony or the Canon cameras. This is gonna sound weird, but I really enjoy touching this camera. When it comes to just like pushing the buttons and the dials, like this is a pleasure to use. And one of my favorite things about this camera is that when you wanna switch between video and photo mode, there's simply a dial at the very top that you flip, photo, video. It's that easy. And one thing that really impressed me is that the battery life in this camera is better than both the Sony a6400 and the Canon M50. This battery lasted me about 2.5 days of regular shooting. And when it comes to IOs and inputs, it's got a mic jack for external audio, USB, HDMI, and one thing that this camera does better than both the Sony cameras and the Canon cameras is the fact that it gives you a dial at the front to change aperture, one in the back to change shutter speed. Usually you only have one, and then you have some kind of compromise workaround to change the other one. This camera feels like a proper DSLR in my hands. It has all the same buttons, the functions, where buttons should be. In my opinion, this is my new